And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain. And when he was set, his disciples came unto him. And he opened his mouth, and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so on and so forth. That is Matthew 5 to 10 from the New Testament. And I'm reciting it because today we're going to be talking about the notion and concept, a very odd one, of intrinsic value. And you can't really talk about the concept of intrinsic value, a very Western value, I might add, without invoking something concerning Judeo-Christian principles, specifically Christianity. But we'll come to that later in greater detail. Depending on your age, but I think pretty much everyone has heard the term intrinsic value applied to human beings. You know, despite all our differences, our different abilities, some people being luckier than other people being less lucky, our market value, so to speak. At core, at heart, we all have the same intrinsic value as human beings. It's a very interesting perspective to have because, generally speaking, you don't really see this reflected in other civilizations and cultures. It's a very Western idea, and you hear it especially from conservatives. We'll talk about people on the left as well, because they also have their ethereal, abstract belief in intrinsic value, although it is fundamentally different from the conservative one. But the first thing we need to say is that intrinsic value doesn't really exist, not as such. Now, you might want to cite some professions, such as firefighting or doctors, and say, well, they believe in the principle of intrinsic value. After all, a firefighter or a group of firefighters doesn't show up to a burning building and then evaluate the looks, intelligence, and market contributions of the residents in the burning building, and they rush in, they try to rescue them, and that's it. In similar fashion, if somebody shows up on a stretcher bleeding out in an emergency room, nobody is going to question that person's value. As a matter of principle, the people in the ER, the doctors, the nurses, etc., will attempt to save the life of the person in question. The important thing to emphasize here is it is a principle born of professional obligation. It is the job of surgeons and doctors and the people working in the ER to help people and save their lives, born of the job itself. Likewise, firefighters are there to put out fires and, if need be, rescue people. It's in the job description, so to speak. They're not engaging in this behavior en masse because of a professed belief in the intrinsic value of every individual. Although I suppose you could argue that the notion of intrinsic value has meandered its way into these professions. But apart from these professional obligations, there really isn't any such thing as intrinsic value. People talk about it. They might talk about the ugly, short, unattractive, unintelligent man as having the same intrinsic value as a tall, handsome, intelligent, wealthy man. But in actual practice, in every aspect and respect of life, you never see the notion of intrinsic value really being applied. People are constantly engaging in evaluations of you, of other people, based on the package you bring to the table. And that package, unfortunately, is largely a byproduct of your genes, a topic which, of course, I've addressed ad nauseum on this channel, and shall continue to do so until my last breath. So in actual practice, we don't really act in a way that accords with intrinsic value. We treat everyone differently based on a host of different features, attributes, qualities. Men are treated differently from women. Women are treated differently from men. More attractive women are treated differently than less attractive women. Same thing with men. People are treated differently on the basis of their height, their ethnicity, their religion, and indeed their intelligence. After all, who is more valuable to society? A masterful heart surgeon or a guy who can barely string sentences together? Now, at the end of the day, and the middle of the day, and the beginning of the day, intrinsic value just isn't really a thing. It's not baked into any core of how we operate in this world. Everyone is being evaluated And nobody, apart from those engaged in certain professional obligations, actually operates this way in practice. And there's some interesting ways of looking at this. If intrinsic value were universal, for example, and you had a thought experiment, say 1,000 children versus 2 children that were your own children, you would think the sum total of the intrinsic value of the 1,000 other children would be greater than the value of your genetically related offspring. After all, in a consequentialist fashion, 1,000 lives of intrinsic value easily trump 2 lives of similarly intrinsic value. But since nobody looks at these things in terms of intrinsic value, parents, in almost all cases, will save their own 2 children before the 1,000 other children. Now, a lot of people might resent them for that, even though they would act in the exact same way under similar circumstances. Admittedly, it's an extreme example, but one that bears out this point. Intrinsic value just isn't a thing. It's not how we operate. The question is, though, how did we get here? Why do we have this platitude in our society that people frequently reference? It's actually pretty simple. It lies in Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, it starts with Judaism, where they have some of this emphasis of life being inherently valuable in the eyes of God, but this principle really attains its highest form and is best embodied in Christianity, which is why I quoted Matthew 5 to Matthew 10, because you see it best embodied in that context, namely, those who suffer, those who are disadvantaged, the meek, they shall inherit the earth. These are the people that they're trying to appeal to, people that have been disadvantaged, people that are unlucky, people that did not win the lottery of life, either circumstantially and certainly not genetically. Matthew's communicating here, well, hold on, guys. You're going through a lot of BS and you're suffering, but guess what? It's okay, because God acknowledges your value and God will reward you in the kingdom of heaven. Don't worry about this earthly existence, because at the end of the day, God, your creator, sees value in you, and you will be rewarded accordingly after this miserable existence on earth. It's one of the biggest pieces of copium ever invented, in my humble opinion. You wouldn't have these people running around talking about intrinsic value, this pablum that doesn't really make any sense in practice because nobody operates according to this principle. Typically, and it makes sense, of course, it's conservatives who will talk about the intrinsic value. You have people like Charles Murray, who's done a lot of research and work in IQ, who will say, just because you're smarter doesn't mean that you're a more valuable person. Your intrinsic value doesn't change. Jordan Peterson, who similarly has done a lot of psychometric research into IQ, will say something along the same lines. It doesn't affect your intrinsic value. If you only have an IQ of 80, it doesn't mean you're less valuable than the guy with an IQ of 140. But again, in actual practice, in every metric of life, in all likelihood, very likely, a guy with an IQ of 140, assuming he doesn't have any other debilitating conditions, is going to contribute a lot more to society, to life, than a guy with an IQ of 80. The fact that people like Charles Murray and Jordan Peterson repeat this platitude, and may or may not believe it, is just a holdover from older times. One thing to be absolutely clear is the internet has really opened up the floodgates to the notion that intrinsic value is some of the biggest poppycock ever invented, because you never see it on display. So conservatives will cling to this view, people on the right, especially if they're religious, but even if they're not religious. After all, it is an inheritance of Judeo-Christian tradition. What about people on the left? What principle do they cleave to? They do not cleave to the same exact, every human being has intrinsic value because somehow, in some metaphysical sense, after all, that's really what this comes down to. We're all equal in the eyes of God. But what the left does, and what they cleave to, is the principle of universal potential. It's not the only principle they have, but everyone has value because the left, generally speaking, not everyone believes this, but most of them, the left believes that all human beings have the same potential. It's just it's not always reached because of environment, circumstances, bad luck, racism, prejudice, bias, whatever. But everyone is basically the same. Everyone is the blank slate, right? And we are this blank canvas unto which all things can be written at the end of the day. That is the principle of the left, and in its own right is a kind of intrinsic value perspective on human life. Timmy isn't actually dumber than Robert over there. Robert just got lucky because his parents were wealthy and they happen to be doctors and lawyers, and I wonder how they even became doctors and lawyers. I guess they must have finagled the system and got there somehow. Whereas Timmy's mother is an alcoholic and his father was a drug addict that left him at age 2. It's all about the potential of human beings, the universal potential, which is a sort of intrinsic value in the eyes of the left. So both the right and left have their versions of intrinsic value. It's just that you never see this in operation, and the people that profess this don't even engage in this behavior. Again, setting aside professional obligations, say those of a paramedic rescuing somebody, or a firefighter, or a doctor, it just isn't really a thing. As I've said, the internet has done a tremendous job of debunking this fiction, and sometimes outright lie, because sometimes it's a lie that's told perniciously, because we constantly see these evaluations of you as a person and of people at large on display nonstop. You see it above all online, and then when you go about your daily life, you might start noticing and picking up on it in your daily life too. But hey, we're all equal in the eyes of God, are we not? Now, as with many things, I'm of two minds to some degree. On the one hand, I think there might be some utility in maintaining useful lies, delusions, and fictions, such as the notion of a God, or the notion of intrinsic value, or of a detached, amorphous love that isn't necessarily bound to the vagaries and the rules of biology. Part of me thinks, yeah, that's probably good, sort of, but then you look at all the pain, the suffering, the misery that exists already on its own right, and then on top of that, you see the pain, the suffering, the misery, the sadness, the displeasure that people experience upon the revelation that these sacred and hallowed principles that people have been preaching about to them for the gods only know how long are poppycock, they're BS, they're not true. And every aspect of their life proves that they're not true. And then it's rubbed in their face again and again and again by the internet, which then they see reflected in real life. They're confronted then by this reality, and people repeatedly tell them they're just imagining it. But it's so obviously the case that they're not imagining this. And what do you end up with? You end up with a situation, the one that we currently find ourselves in, where this stuff is basically irrefutable. And so it's not even an option to pretend anymore. Pretense only works if there are people credulous enough to buy into it. If people are not credulous enough to buy into it, then it doesn't matter what the actual potential utility of a false belief might be, it falls apart on its own. And ultimately, that's probably where my position lies on this. There's such a mountain of evidence that intrinsic value is BS that there's no point in pretending to believe in it. It just doesn't work in the real world. So I would rather pull down the curtains on this and talk about it as it actually is, as opposed to how we want it to be. Yes, we're all equal in the eyes of God. Will that help me pay the rent? Will that make me smarter, more attractive? Will that fix your illness? Not really. And nobody buys into this principle in their real life either. We are all either pretending that's true or not pretending it's true, and we're just evaluating people on a constant basis, one way or another. So better to pull down the curtains on this at the end of the day than to perpetuate a harmful lie. And credit where it's due. I love this meme. 400 weeks, 1 Meeks. Thank you for watching, as always. Much appreciated. Many special thanks to my patrons on Patreon. You guys are the best. You keep the channel alive. Without you, this channel couldn't exist. Many special thanks to my donors on PayPal as well. And if you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, it'd be appreciated. Until the next time, may the gods watch over you. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out then. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.